It's good to see you again, and I know we're going to get together here Wednesday night at 7:45 to 9 o'clock for our first board meeting of the year. And so this functions as both my pastor's report and training, in a sense, as we prepare ourselves for the new church year and what God's calling us to do. And so I'm really excited about this year. And for the next 3 months, so September, October, and November, we will be meeting together monthly, and we will be focusing on some key things. I really feel led that this year should be a year of discernment for us. And so what discernment really means is the ability to judge wisely, to judge correctly. In a Christian sense, it's the ability to see what God sees for us and scan out over the horizon and discern what God is doing in our lives and in our world and what He would have us do as a body. And so there are a couple of ways that we first think about discernment, and one of those is the way that Jaron talks to churches about the function of the board. Now, there are two main functions of a church board. The church board is a governance board. It's an oversight board. It's a clarity board. It's not a managing board. Our committees do more of the management and execution, and certainly pastors are called to do day-to-day operations of the church. But the board provides oversight or guarding the mission and funding the mission. Those are the two things we do. First, we guard the mission. So what does that mean for us? I mean, we all know what it means to be Christian, but the board has the responsibility to make sure that along with the church, we are in alignment with God's mission. And so we look at things like our vision statement. Are we going in the direction of a table and towel community? Are we becoming radically hospitable? Are we engaging in sacrificial servanthood? Are we the kind of people who are contagious in our love for one another in God's world? Those are the things that we have to talk about together. Are we getting there? Are we being who God's called us to be? Are we doing the things that God's called us to do? Are we really worshiping Him with holy lives? Are we really the kind of people who are extending God's grace to our neighbors and our community? Are we evangelistic? Are we doing the things of compassion and meeting the needs of our neighbors? Those are the kind of things we have to look at. So are we guarding the mission? Or are we just another institution that functions like any other civic institution? Are we engaging in things that would take us away from the actual mission of our life together? The second thing is funding the mission. So funding the mission means that we align our monies towards our goals. Once we know what our goals are, then we are able to then execute those goals by making sure that ministries are resourced in the way that they need to be resourced. Now, there are some fixed costs that we have. Primarily, our building is going to cost a certain amount of money to both pay the mortgage and maintain it. And so we have to be wary of the fact that we want to keep our fixed costs as low as possible. And so that's really important for us to do. Secondarily, we have to think about, when it comes to funding the mission, what are the forces that make that difficult for us? What are the forces that are at work against us? So you think about the forces spiritually. Really, money in the Bible and our use of it and the way that we distribute it is seen from a very spiritual perspective. And so a lack of money at times can come down to some spiritual hard-heartedness. It can come down to a spirit of consumerism, and Steph's going to talk about that in a couple weeks. It can come down to some things spiritually where we're really engaging in spiritual war in the sense that we're engaging these powers and principalities. But there are other things we have to look at sociologically. 25 years ago, North Johnson County looked very different than it does today. If you would pay attention to the changing demographics of our neighborhood, the kind of people that are moving in here, we have to pay attention to the fact that where our church is physically located does have some change to it. We also have to pay attention to things systemically. Now, I want to say this about systems. There are a lot of things that are actually beyond our control. Where our people live, how long it takes to drive to church, there's not a lot that we can actually do about that. But we have to pay attention to it. For example, One of our system changes a few years back now was the flip of Sunday school before church to after church to be in alignment with what's happening in the worship service. That made a huge difference for us, not only in terms of attendance, but in terms of deepening our community and inviting people into community. That was a systemic change. We're still doing Sunday school, but we had to do it a little bit differently in a way that made sense, in a way that matches the kind of social factors that are happening around us and our spiritual needs at the moment. So I want us to look at that. We have to discern, does our system work? Are we effectively continuing to try to be a church that's designed to meet the needs of today? Or are we trying to be designed to meet the needs of tomorrow? Or are we living in the past in ways that don't actually work anymore? And so we have to discern those kind of things. And there are systemic factors that we can change to get a better result of being who we want to be. And so I want us to think about those things as well as we discern things this year. So that's what it means to be a discerning church. And that's what we need for this year of discernment. Now the next thing I want to talk about, these are things that the manual actually requires us to do, and that's expectations. Now just a little brief story about expectations. Stephanie and I go about our lives very differently, and I think have different expectations when we got married about how things would work. And being a single guy for a long time, my expectations about keeping house were a little bit different than her natural expectations about keeping house. And just things that are important to her, things that she wants in place, like I won't always fold the blanket that we use on the couch because I think, hey, I'm going to use that again tomorrow. It's not always my expectation to put that back in its place after every use. Now, it's more important for Steph to do that. And so, some of those things are important for us to know, because if we aren't clear in our expectations, then we're going to have frustrations and we're going to have confusion. And then we're going to start trying to figure out why a person is trying to be a jerk to us when they're not really trying to be a jerk. They're just doing what they naturally would do. And so those are where marital conflicts come from. And as soon as we learn each other's expectations and clarify, then we understand that, hey, we're actually all on the same page a lot more than we think that we are. But also, we know how we can better meet each other's needs. And so another way of thinking about expectations is also clarifying love languages. So we want to do that this year. And the manual actually says the church board needs to help set expectations with the senior pastor and the pastoral team every year. Now, that's a thing that's kind of worked in there over time that for the most part doesn't ever happen, at least not in the way where we turn those into the district. And I'd like to start doing that. That actually, I think, sounds like a great idea for clarity that we could do that would help us know where we're going and how we're trying to minister to God's church together. And so what I want us to begin doing is to develop some SMART goals for me, for the pastors, for the church. What are SMART goals? They're specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time-bound goals. We pastors will work like crazy, honestly, every day of the week, trying to do what we're called to do. Now, we know some of the things that we are trying to do, but there's also some local flavor and context. And while we might be trying to meet needs in one way, we might be missing needs in another way. Or we might come to find that through all of our goals, that our goals for the congregation are really different. Or we might find that we have so many goals that there is just no humanly way possible that any pastor or pastoral staff can meet them on their own. Or we find out that some of the goals that we have are actually goals that God has designed for the body of Christ and not necessarily for the pastors. That's a story in Acts chapter 6 talks about that, where the body really needed people to step up. And there were too many needs for widows and orphans, and the apostles had to be given to the apostolic ministry of building the church. And so the church needed to pray for effectively what becomes the idea of a deacon to step up and meet the needs of the body. So clarity will help us figure that out. The last thing that we need to begin focusing on, and we will probably do first, actually, as we talk about those other things generally, are goals that the district superintendent, our Bishop Jaron Rao, has for us. And that's his Vision 2020. So right now it's 2015, so in 5 years from now, or less than 5 actually, he wants to know how we would assign a numerical value to how many members we expect to have as a church in that year. Now actually what I would say is how many new members, because that actually is a new and accurate number. And then I would say the second one that he would like to know is how many people we expect to average in worship. Now we have multiple venues for worship, so we'd have to look at those. But what would that total number be by the year 2020 is something that he's asking from us. And for Sunday school and discipleship ministries, what would our number of people participating in those more intimate, life-giving communities? And so for us, we have 2. How many people in the year 2020 do we expect to have in Sunday school? How many people in the year 2020 should we expect to have in our life groups? And finally, one really important one is new works. Now, a new work can mean anything. It can mean a new worship service. It can mean a preaching point. It can mean a parent-affiliated congregation, or it can be a church-type mission where we actually plant another church like we did a few years back with Grace Point. How many new works are we going to be engaged in? So there are some specific measurables that we're being asked to discern together. But all of this is a year of discernment. We have been called as pastors and servant leaders of Shawnee to discern where we're at, what God is doing, and where we're going. And so I want us to think about that. Think about that with these questions that I'm going to be asking you, and really go through this lesson and give me some feedback. But this is my first report to you. The pastor's reports will also be included, attached in this email. But I'm excited about what God has for us. There's some really cool things going on. Just a couple weeks ago, we had 40 MNU students and NTS students at our house for lunch. A few years back, that would have been a very difficult number to achieve. So God's doing some cool things and some really good and new things. But we also have our challenges. And we also have challenges that are big ones that we're going to have to meet, that whether we like it or not, the changing society, the changing demographics, all sorts of things. But I believe that God has an answer for every one of these things. So I look forward to working with you this whole year. We're excited about starting this new year. I will see you on Wednesday night at 7:45. We will meet in 2 Umpteen.